Most people assume that soldiers die in battle. But one of the deadliest events of the American Revolutionary War proves the exact opposite. In 1777, approximately 2,000 soldiers lost their lives at the Valley Forge encampment. Moreover, there wasn't even a single battle. It was simply a camp where soldiers waited out the winter. Given this, most people assume the cause of death was freezing cold or starvation. But the reality was very different from what we might think. By the way, if you're interested in military history documentaries like this, you can subscribe to the channel and join us. Now, let's find out together what actually caused the soldiers' deaths at Valley Forge. Here is the first thing to understand, and it is the thing that makes the whole matter so strange. No battle was ever fought at Valley Forge. The place was not a battlefield. It was a winter encampment, a defensive position where the Continental Army went to wait out the cold months of late 1777 and early 1778. The British held Philadelphia a day's march away, and rather than fight in the dead of winter, both armies settled in to endure the season. Valley Forge was chosen because it was defensible, close enough to keep an eye on the enemy, and far enough to be safe from a surprise attack. So there were no cannon here, no charges, no volleys of musket fire deciding the fate of the war. And yet, over the 6 months the army spent in this camp, something in the region of 2,000 men died. The exact figure is debated, and we will come back to why. But the scale is not in serious doubt. Around 1 in 6 of the men who marched into Valley Forge did not march out. Put that number against the battles of the Revolution, and it becomes startling. Most engagements of the war killed a few hundred men on each side, often far fewer. The bloodiest single days of the entire conflict rarely approached the toll of that one quiet winter in a camp where not a single shot was fired in anger. The men of Valley Forge were killed by their own encampment, which forces the real question. If no enemy attacked them, if no battle was fought, what actually killed 2,000 soldiers? The popular answer is the cold, the image of men freezing to death in the snow. That answer is mostly wrong, and the truth is both stranger and more disturbing. Ask most people what killed the soldiers at Valley Forge, and they will tell you the same thing. They froze. They starved. The image is fixed in the national memory. The barefoot men in the snow, the empty stomachs, the bitter cold. And it is not that this image is false. The suffering was real and it was severe. The men were genuinely short of food, sometimes desperately so. And the winter was genuinely cold, and thousands of them genuinely lacked adequate shoes and clothing. All of that is documented beyond dispute, and all of it contributed to what happened. Cold and hunger weaken a body, and a weakened body is far more vulnerable to what actually did the killing. But here is the distinction that matters. Very few men at Valley Forge actually froze to death, in the sense of dying directly from exposure to the cold, and relatively few starved to death in the strict sense of dying from lack of food. Death by direct freezing or outright starvation, while it happened, was not the main event. It was not what produced that toll of 2,000. The cold and the hunger were not the executioners. They were the conditions that opened the door. They wore the men down, packed them together seeking warmth, weakened their bodies, and created the perfect environment for the thing that did the real killing. To understand Valley Forge, you have to stop thinking about the weather and start thinking about something much smaller and much more lethal. The men of Valley Forge were killed overwhelmingly by disease, not by the enemy, not by the cold, not directly by hunger, but by sickness that spread through the camp and killed the weakened, crowded, exhausted men in their thousands. Several diseases did the work. There was typhus, spread by lice, which thrive in exactly the conditions of a winter camp where men cannot wash, cannot change clothes, and huddle together for warmth in crowded huts. There was typhoid fever and dysentery, spread through water and food contaminated by human waste, in a camp where sanitation was poor and understanding of how disease spread simply did not exist. And there was smallpox, one of the great killers of the age, moving through a population with no reliable protection against it. These were the true causes of death at Valley Forge. Fever, the bloody flux, as they called dysentery, the wasting and the delirium of typhus, the terrible progression of smallpox. Men reported sick, were sent to crude camp hospitals that were often little more than death houses, and a great many of them never came out. And this is why the cold and the hunger mattered so much, even though they were not the direct cause. A well-fed man in clean clothing with room to breathe can often fight off these infections. A man who is starving, freezing, exhausted, and packed into a filthy hut with a dozen others has almost no defense. The malnutrition and the exposure did not kill the men directly. They stripped away the body's ability to survive the diseases that did. To understand how disease could kill on this scale, you have to picture what the camp was actually like, because it was, without anyone intending it, almost perfectly designed to breed and spread infection. Start with the huts. 12,000 men built themselves roughly 1,000 small log huts, and into each of these they packed around a dozen soldiers. These huts were small, dark, poorly ventilated, and almost impossible to keep clean. Smoke filled them from the fires. Damp seeped into them, and a dozen men slept, ate, and lived crammed together in a space that gave sickness a direct path from one body to the next. When one man in a hut fell ill, the others were breathing the same air, sharing the same surfaces, crawling with the same lice. Then there was the sanitation, or the lack of it. An army of 12,000 men produces an enormous quantity of human and animal waste, and 18th century camps had only the crudest systems for dealing with it. Latrines were often too few, poorly placed, and badly maintained. Waste contaminated the ground and the water supply. In a world with no knowledge of germs, no one understood that the water they drank and the filth around their huts were carrying the very diseases killing them. Add the dead animals, the rotting food scraps, the mud that never dried, the impossibility of proper washing in the depth of winter, and the constant arrival of new men carrying new infections. The camp was a closed environment where thousands of weakened people lived, pressed together in filth, and where every condition that spreads disease was present at once. No one designed it to be lethal. The men built what they could with what they had, in the middle of winter, under enormous pressure. But the result was an environment where a body of soldiers, gathered to fight a war, was quietly consumed by the invisible enemies breeding in their own camp. It would be wrong to say that nothing was done. People at the time understood, even without knowing about germs, that the camp was killing men, and some of them fought hard to change it. The medical staff of the army, such as it was, labored under impossible conditions. Surgeons and physicians treated the sick with the limited knowledge of the age, which meant they often could do little more than watch. They had no antibiotics, no understanding of infection, and remedies that ranged from the useless to the actively harmful. The camp hospitals they worked in were overwhelmed, understaffed, and so dangerous that being sent to one was sometimes a death sentence in itself, because the sick were concentrated together where infections passed freely between them. Leadership tried to impose order. Orders came down demanding that the huts be kept cleaner, that latrines be dug properly and covered, that the camp be policed for filth, that fresh straw be found for bedding. There was a real effort to improve the sanitary condition of the camp, driven by the recognition that the army was melting away, not from battle, but from sickness. And there was one weapon that genuinely worked. Against smallpox, the army undertook a program of inoculation, deliberately giving soldiers a mild, controlled case of the disease to protect them from the deadlier natural form. The method was crude and carried real danger, since a small number of those inoculated died from the procedure itself. But the odds it offered were vastly better than facing the full disease unprotected. It was a bold and risky decision, and it was one of the most consequential medical undertakings of the war. It saved a great many lives, and it reflected a real understanding that the invisible killers in the camp had to be fought as seriously as any British army. It is worth pausing on how remarkable that decision was. In an age with no knowledge of germs, no microscope showing what caused disease, and no theory of infection as we understand it, the leadership still grasped, through hard experience, that smallpox could be blunted by deliberate exposure. They could not see the enemy, but they had learned something true about how it behaved, and they acted on it at real risk. It was one of the few moves against the camp's invisible killers that actually changed the outcome. But knowledge has limits, and the limits of 18th century medicine were severe. The men could clean the camp and inoculate against one disease, but they could not stop typhus and dysentery and fever from doing their work. They were fighting an enemy they could not fully see with tools that were not equal to it. We keep saying around 2,000, and it is worth being honest about why the number is not more precise, because the uncertainty tells you something important about the whole event. Record-keeping in the Continental Army was imperfect at the best of times, and Valley Forge was not the best of times. Men died in huts in hospitals scattered across the countryside, and after being moved away sick. Some deaths were recorded carefully and some were not recorded at all. Soldiers who fell ill in the camp were often sent to hospitals miles away, and if they died there, their deaths might be counted somewhere else entirely, or lost in the gaps between different sets of records. There is also the question of what counts as a Valley Forge death. A man who caught a fatal fever in the camp but died weeks later after being moved. Was that a death at Valley Forge or somewhere else? The historians who have studied this have arrived at estimates that cluster around 2,000 for the encampment itself. But reasonable people put the figure somewhat lower or somewhat higher, depending on exactly what they count and which records they trust. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the account. It is a true reflection of what the event was. This was not a battle with a clear beginning and end, and a body count taken afterward. It was a slow, grinding, months-long attrition, spread across huts and hospitals and roads, in which men sickened and died a few at a time, day after day, until the total reached into the thousands. The imprecision of the number is itself a portrait of how the dying actually happened. Now let us test the claim in the title directly and honestly, because it deserves scrutiny rather than acceptance. Did more men really die at Valley Forge than in any battle of the Revolution? For the American side, The answer is essentially yes. The battles of the Revolutionary War were, by the standards of later wars, relatively small in their casualties. American deaths in even the larger engagements typically numbered in the hundreds. There was no single battle in which the Continental Army lost 2,000 men killed. So a winter encampment that killed roughly that many did indeed cost more American lives than any single battle of the war. But it is worth being careful and fair about the comparison. Battle deaths and camp deaths are different things spread over different time frames. A battle kills its men in hours. Valley Forge killed its men over 6 months. And disease, not combat, was actually the single greatest killer of soldiers throughout the entire Revolutionary War, and indeed throughout almost every war before the 20th century. Valley Forge was not a strange exception in this respect. It was a concentrated, visible example of what was quietly happening to armies everywhere, all the time. So the honest version of the claim is this: Valley Forge was not uniquely deadly because of some special horror found only there. It was deadly because it concentrated in one place and one winter, the ordinary and overwhelming killer of pre-modern armies. More men died there than in any battle because, in the era before modern medicine, that was simply what happened when you gathered thousands of weakened men together in one place for months. The battles were the exception. The camp was the rule. So return, finally, to those 2,000 men and consider what their deaths actually represented, because it is easy to let a number like that become abstract. Each of them was a man who had volunteered or been enlisted to fight for a cause, and who died without ever facing the enemy he had come to fight. He did not fall in a charge or a famous last stand. He died shivering with fever in a smoky hut, or wasting away in a crowded hospital, killed by an infection whose name he may not even have known. There was nothing glorious in it, and nothing that fit the heroic image of war. It was a bad, slow, undignified death, repeated 2,000 times. And yet their deaths were not meaningless, precisely because of what the Army became despite them. Valley Forge is remembered not as a disaster, but as a turning point, because the Army that survived that winter came out of it more organized, better trained, and more determined than the one that went in. The men who died were part of the price of keeping that Army in existence through the winter when it might have simply dissolved. They held the line not against an enemy, but against the collapse of the whole enterprise. It is worth remembering them as they actually were, not as the myth would have them. Not warriors cut down in battle, but ordinary men who signed up for a war and were killed by fever and filth and the terrible bad luck of being gathered together in the wrong place at the wrong time. That they are remembered as heroes is right. But the reason they died is a reminder that in the wars of that age, the deadliest enemy a soldier faced was rarely the one across the field. It was the one breeding silently in his own camp. When people hear Valley Forge, the first things that come to mind are often the freezing cold and hunger. But as we've seen today, these weren't the soldiers' only enemies. The real danger was disease, which was nearly impossible to control. People can sometimes endure the cold and hunger, but once disease spread, there was almost no hope of survival for many soldiers. Perhaps the greatest struggle at Valley Forge was the battle against invisible enemies. Now, I'd like to ask you one final question. If you were a soldier living during that time, which would have frightened you the most? Not knowing what you'd face on the battlefield, or the possibility of slowly dying from disease?